Recency bias might kill the sports industry. And before I get into why, a lot of what I cover here, I also covered in this article over on my website. So if you enjoyed this video and want a deeper dive into how recency bias might actually kill the sports media industry, then please go check it out. But how is it flawed, you might ask? The sports media industry seems to be doing fantastically well. The Sky Sports Premier League YouTube channel is routinely eclipsing 100k views on analyses, breakdowns, and obviously their highlight videos. All of that to go along with their shorts, which are quite literally quick view machines. And ESPN's First Take remains the #1 morning show in America, and it's been there for the last 13 years, almost 14 now. Even better, for those who are not fortunate enough to be part of these massive corporations like ESPN or Sky, we've seen a newfound love for sports podcasts. Some of the most notable are The Rest is Football with Gary Lineker, Alan Shearer, and Micah Richards, The Pat McAfee Show with Pat McAfee, and New Heights with the Kelsey brothers. By most metrics, the sports industry is experiencing unprecedented growth and popularity. But a lack of growth is not the problem, it's a lack of quality. And recency bias is to blame. Recency bias is a cognitive bias where people place too much emphasis on the latest events and the most recent information when forming beliefs or opinions, often ignoring more relevant historical trends or data. And this happens because information about the latest events are just more readily accessible to us in our short-term memory. So when we're making takes about teams and players right after we've watched them play, we often neglect some of the long-term data or trends about that player or team in favor of the things that we just watched in the most recent game. And as fans, sure, this might happen all the time, but in the sports media industry, this is actually a really big problem. This is because people tune into shows like First Take or Super Sunday to actually learn about what's going on in sports. We place trust in the industry specialists, the journalists, the pundits, the ex-pros to provide us with understandings of the things that us as fans who don't have experience in the field wouldn't be able to understand on our own. In other words, the industry is propped up on the wholehearted trust that us, as consumers, place in those that are journalists, pundits, ex-pros, all of the industry specialists to provide us with good, sound information. If those industry experts mislead us or have any ulterior motives, then we are extremely susceptible to being misinformed and having full belief in that misinformation. But recency bias presents a really big problem for these TV stations and these industry experts to actually provide us with sound and founded content or information about sports. And this is because these stations, podcasts, social media channels have to update us on the latest events. It would be very strange for Sky Sports to just not put out highlight videos any given week, or for First Take to not talk about the crazy story that happened in the NBA last night. But by covering the most recent events all the time, TV stations, industry specialists, and even social media channels are extremely vulnerable to being influenced by recency bias when they try to feed that new information back into the wider narrative. And that's because the most recent events are only a fraction of that bigger picture, but because of recency bias, we place a lot of emphasis on the most recent things that just happened. So when Stephen A. Smith makes a take like Kawhi Leonard
is the worst superstar I have ever seen in sports,
and
I think the man should retire. I'm sick of these injuries to Kawhi Leonard.
It does little to help the average fan understand what Kawhi Leonard's legacy should be in the history books. And that's because Stephen A is placing a lot of emphasis on the last 3, 4, 5 years of Kawhi Leonard's career instead of figuring out exactly how those years should fit in to his full legacy. Now, on top of this, another problem with the way that recency bias affects the sports media industry is the way that it can actually alter the way that we remember history. For years, Matthew Stafford spent his days in Detroit putting up crazy numbers, flashing his incredible talent, but ultimately losing games. And that reputation stuck with him. He was seen as a quarterback that can, put up a bunch of crazy numbers, make some highlight plays, but he didn't really have what it took to win. Fast forward to today, and he spent his last 5 years with the LA Rams. He won a Super Bowl in his very first season. He's won 63% of his games thus far, well up from the 45% he won in Detroit. And he's even in the running for MVP this season. To put it lightly, Stafford has completely shut all of his haters up. And in an attempt to be ahead of the curve and buy into Stafford stocks right now, people have tried to change the narrative about those days back in Detroit. Back then, he was seen as a $53 million mistake, the kind of quarterback that you didn't really want to put trust in if you wanted to win a Super Bowl. Now, people are blaming Detroit and the organization for not really allowing him to maximize or show his full capabilities. And some have gone as far as to say that Matthew Stafford is an all-time great QB, with the guys over on the Speakeasy podcast saying that if he wins another Super Bowl, he's a top 6 quarterback of all time. And I'm not here to argue with whether Matthew Stafford is top 5, top 6, top 10, or even top 20. I'm concerned with the fact that 5 years seem to have been able to completely erase the kind of reputation that at one point seemed unshakable. And to be completely honest, It's really just 2 years that's doing all of this heavy lifting, because the years between 22 and 24, they weren't really great years for Stafford or the Rams. So that Super Bowl winning season in 21 and this MVP caliber season thus far in 25 seem to have completely changed the narrative on Matthew Stafford. And this is why recency bias is bad for the sports media industry. We should be able to build on previous takes, previous articles, or reports and analyses. We shouldn't be tearing them down and rewriting narratives just because the previous ones don't fit what we believe right now. If we continue to do this narrative changing and history rewriting, then we face a problem that a lot of articles, reports, or deep dives will be rendered useless or obsolete after just a few weeks or a few months, and new information completely changes the way we see certain players or teams. But far more dangerously, and the main point of this video, is that if we continue to keep doing this, we run the risk of completely alienating all sports fans. This because they'll see their favorite journalists, pundits, or even ex-pro flip-flopping and changing their ideas as new games and new plays are made. And remember, the sports industry is predicated on trust. If fans see their favorite journalists and pundits flip-flopping every week, they don't really know if they should believe them, if they should place stock in what they say, and if that continues, it could really spell the end of the sports media industry. People may tune into First Take and just completely disregard everything Stephen A says because they no longer have any trust in him. And if that happens, then the sports media industry completely loses all of its value. Right now, it's valuable because the people that are in the industry are supposed to be informative. They're supposed to be trustworthy. They're supposed to be the kinds of people that we learn sports from. And if we don't trust them, who do we learn sports from? Now, obviously, this is a very drastic outcome. It's probably the worst case scenario that could come of the effect recency bias has on the sports industry. But all it would take for this to be realized is for the majority of sports fans to realize that recency bias has a really big effect on the way that not only fans, but those in the industry make their takes and actually inform people. So if these kind of shows and takes from people in the sports media industry are so damaging to the average fan, why are people like Stephen A, Skip Bayless, and Rio Ferdinand still so prominent in space? Well, the thing about the sports industry and us as fans is that we may present ourselves as being primarily interested in sports, the X's and O's, the ins and outs, but for many of us, that's not actually the case. Just like many other industries like finance or education, most people want quick, bite-sized pieces of information that they can form what they feel like are strong opinions from. And the sports industry knows this. Reels, TikToks, and shorts that make profound emotional statements like Kawhi Leonard is the worst superstar in NBA history will engage fans because it gives rise to high arousal emotions like awe, anger, amusement, and fear, which in turn drives likes, shares, retweets, and helps the sports industry grow. And as anyone who knows anything about business and companies, all companies want to grow, even if sometimes that's at the expense of what you might think is the primary function of that company. And for sports media companies, it seems like they're okay with sacrificing some quality and the goal of producing genuine, well-founded content for growth. But there is a way that we can solve this problem. And the sports media industry probably won't like this solution, but if we swap the reels, the TikToks, and the emotional content for more deep dives and informed debates, we'd likely see the power of recency bias over the industry dwindle. And thus the integrity and the foundation of the industry would be much stronger. After all, it has been stated that the recency effect is increased when too much information is presented too quickly and reduced when it's coupled with other tasks. This reinforces the idea that quick-fire, short-form content that consumers can consume a lot of in a short amount of time exacerbates the problem that recency bias presents. But also that if we couple our coverage of the latest events with other tasks like setting out wider narratives, doing deep dives, or having informed debates, we can reduce the effects that recency bias has. It may result in sports media companies experiencing less growth, less engagements, fewer views, less likes, all of that stuff, but it would solve the problems that recency bias presents. Now, you might argue that this solution is far too oversimplified for a problem that could kill the sports industry. But I'd say that the solution really doesn't need to be very complicated. If we're liable to be influenced by a bias that preys on the recency of events, then we can make a concerted effort to stop producing so much content that revolves around those events in isolation. Instead of pieces or shows being written or made solely about the most recent events, we can try to feed them into a wider narrative or certain circumstances that surround that player or team. That way, we have a better chance of truly capturing the correct weight that these recent events have in the wider narrative. But it isn't clear that a solution like this will actually be put into place. These solutions assume that the industry has a predisposition to producing the best possible content that it can. And it isn't totally clear that this is the case. As I alluded to earlier, TV stations, newspapers, social media channels, and almost every sports media business wants to grow. And since sports fans are also liable to being influenced by recency bias, content centered around that is somewhat attractive to them. As a fan, when you watch your favorite player throw 3 interceptions in a game and then you see First Take talking about how they're the worst quarterback in the NFL, that's kind of attractive to you because it's very possible that you form that exact same opinion based on the recent events that you watched in that game. And since most fans aren't really interested in doing historical dives, looking into data or trends from the past, content that's centered around that is probably better overall isn't attractive to them. So even though the industry could create better content, more informed content, and really pay back the trust that we as fans place in them, that kind of content isn't relatable. It isn't the kind of content that people are going to click on or share to their friends or like or retweet. And thus, it won't generate the kinds of engagements and growth that these companies are fundamentally after. Therefore, this solution isn't really of much use to the industry, and it's very unlikely that it's actually going to be put into place. Why would you give up guaranteed growth and engagements for a content model that might be better in practice and in theory also, but it doesn't actually help you as a business achieve your business goals? To conclude, recency bias is a problem for the sports industry. It directly affects the way that we as fans see the game. We may place too much stock in the most recent play that we just watched, or the most recent game that we just watched. But more importantly, it affects the way that journalists report games too. And even further than the way they just report games, it affects the way that they feed recent events into wider narratives. Just like I said earlier, Stephen A calling for Kawhi to retire because he had a few seasons where he didn't play basketball isn't a good way of feeding information back into a wide narrative. But ultimately, journalists and industry specialists like Stephen A know exactly what they're doing. Takes like Kawhi Leonard should retire are the kinds of takes that get people to watch First Take. And since the sports media industry is experiencing unprecedented growth and engagement, this is probably not going to stop. But at least we know that there is a solution. We could ditch the reels, the TikToks and the shorts and opt for some more informed content that really looks to encompass everything that makes up a wider narrative. Anyway, I'm sure the sports media industry isn't going to die, but it definitely could because of the effects of recency bias. So let me know what you think in the comment section, and I'll see you all on the next one. Peace.